You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHACS.
Good morning, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm Caroline Weaver, and with me is my co-host, Lars Jensen. Hey, Lars, how's it going?
Hey, good afternoon to you. Great here.
Are you back home after your big trip?
I have now circumnavigated the globe, and I am back in Copenhagen. I'm actually at Copenhagen Business School today.
Oh, nice. Awesome. Well, we have got a good episode today. In our past couple of episodes, we've started talking about the impact of the legislation that Trump has been proposing and supporting. And one of the outcomes that we're talking about it having is port congestion. So, Lars, maybe we start with general definition to get everyone on the right page. What is port congestion?
It is a good question because it's a phrase I think everybody's using very frequently, but usually without much thought into what does it actually mean. Sure, there's a congestion, but what are the actual choke points that we're talking about? This is where life gets complicated. Because picture this, one constraining factor that people might think about is, for example, how much time does it take to take the containers off and on a ship? That sounds fairly straightforward. But what's the constraining factor there? One of the constraining factors is how many cranes do you have working on that ship at the same time? That varies from port to port. It can also, in some ports, depend on how many other ships do you have at berth at the same time, where you might have to then separate the cranes to different ships. So already there, we're getting quite a variation in there. The next choke point is you might be able to take the containers off at a certain pace with the cranes. But what about your port equipment? How quickly can you then remove these containers away from the quayside and over onto the stack? If that is not designed in the right way, you're going to limit productivity of the cranes because you can't move the containers fast enough. And vice versa, how quickly can you take the containers from the stack back over to the cranes? So you have a number of different potentially limiting factors at the quayside itself.
Can you talk a little bit about when you were talking about moving the cranes around? I've not heard that before, and I'm sure some of our listeners don't know that's a thing either.
Yeah, I mean, especially in all the large container terminals. I mean, you've got the gantry cranes that are rail mounted. You basically got a whole large rail track along the whole quayside, and the cranes can move along the quayside. So if it's a long quayside, it's not uncommon that by I was about to say a kilometer long, but for our U.S. listeners, let's say it's even a half a mile or a mile long. And then you can have multiple ships laying along there and just have cranes that can move all the way along that quayside. This is again where within the same terminal, so one crane can just slide along and move from one ship and then over and handle on the next ship. But this is again where life becomes complicated because in some terminals you might have you can even find places where the quay is maybe a mile and a half or even 2 miles long in one long stretch, and you can see how you might be able to move cranes along that. But in other places, it's not one long stretch. It's angled, so you have one ship laying at one part of the quay, another ship and another part. And in that case, you cannot move the cranes from one ship to another. It depends on the physical configuration of the port. So again, different ports will have different limiting factors. And that's all what happens on the water side. Then you have the other end of the port over at the interface into the land. So now you have discharged all the containers. Now you need to move them inland. In some ports, that can only be done by truck. So obviously a limiting factor here is how many trucks can you handle per hour? And once more, life becomes complicated. Because it's a matter of you have a gate. So how many trucks can you process at a gate? The truck comes down to the gate at the terminal. Somebody needs to verify that truck is allowed to enter the port, need to verify what's the container he's going to pick up or discharge. That takes time. In some places that is automated. You have automated recognition of the truck's license plates, for example, and the container numbers. In other ports, that's still a manual process. It depends. Then how many gates do you have? Do you only have one? Do you have two? Do you have 8? Depends again on where you are. That also limits how many trucks per hour can you process into the port. Once the truck then gets into the port, what's the turnaround time? How much time does it take for that truck to get to his parking spot near the stack then have a container picked up and put on his truck, for example, or taken off his truck. It's another limiting factor. Even if all of this then works well, you might say, well, why don't we then make 20 gate-in lanes? That will improve the productivity of the port. It might not, because how big is the highway leading to the port? If that's a single lane highway, that is suddenly the limiting factor. So in some ports you can be up against, it doesn't matter if you build more cranes, it doesn't matter if you make the port larger, you may not be able to alleviate that bottleneck if the bottleneck is actually the size of the highway going to and from the port. Then you have ports where it's not just highways, but you can also use rail. That, of course, is another option. In some ports, not so much in the US, apart from a few locations, more in Europe, you will have barges, for example, that you can use as well. All of that adds more nodes in the operation. Every single interface in these is a potential choke. So when we say port congestion, the interesting question is always, which one of all these many factors is the one that is causing the congestion? And the problem here is, we might hear port congestion. If we think back to, for example, during the pandemic, there was a lot of port congestion in US, for example, and there were 100 ships in queue of the Los Angeles, Long Beach. It was evident, sure, there's port congestion. And then various solutions were put up in terms of, but we should put more money into developing port infrastructure. We don't know until we know what's the actual choke point. And at some point, it was not necessarily the crane productivity. It was not necessarily the size of the port. Again, it was some of these inland things. In some of the cases during the pandemic, the limiting factor, interestingly enough, had nothing to do with the port equipment as such. It had everything to do with the availability of chassis, for example. And if you don't have enough chassis, you can have all the port capacity in the world, but the trucks are not going to be able to come down and pick up the containers because of a lack of chassis. So it is an enormously complicated thing when you dig into it. So we started from the headline, port congestion, and it sounds so easy. But the reality is, port congestion sometimes actually has nothing to do with the port, but something to do with the logistical setup in the hinterland. And therefore, we have to be very careful when we want to then alleviate some of these congestion problems, that we are actually trying to put efforts, resources, and money towards solving actual choke point, which might not be in the port.
I was talking to a friend of mine that works at Port Freeport in Texas, a really tiny port that's not too far from Houston. And I was like, hey, I want to talk about port congestion on the next episode. And he's like, well, we don't really get that much port congestion here. Because they're a smaller port, they've got, very streamlined operations. So your point about making a bigger port doesn't necessarily equate to more efficiency. You have to really be able to pinpoint what's happening. But a lot of it is extraneous factors that you can't really control. It's something to do with the trucking industry or weather or labor. We haven't even really talked about labor yet. Maybe we should
and you can say, in your good example here of a small port in Texas, they might be operating perfectly fine. Then you can say, hypothetically, that's great. Let's say double the size of the port. But then all of a sudden, the port might become congested, not because of the port, but what is the capacity of those highways leading into and out of the ports? They might suddenly become the bottleneck. So all of these factors play in. Then we talk labor. Again, conditions vary all over the world in terms of, are you constrained in terms of being able to get the right labor? In some parts of the world, they are more prone to strikes than others. Actually, US is not overly prone to strikes. I mean, yes, it hits the headlines when, for example, there was a tiff between the ILA and USMX, and everybody was afraid of a major strike on the US East Coast, which we had the short strike back in October, and then the strike didn't materialize. Seen overall, it's actually very rare we have strikes in the US ports, whereas over in Europe, for example, it's a fairly common occurrence. Right now, we have congestion issues in some of the French ports because there are, again, strikes. So it varies around the world also how much or how little labor then contributes to some of the congestion issues.
In the ports in Europe, are they normally on strike for wages, or like what usually is the impetus for that?
Oh, that can be many different things. It's not necessarily for wages. Sometimes it's also a matter of what are working conditions. It becomes a lot more complex because also keep in mind labor laws are different in all the different countries of Europe. And in some cases, it's not necessarily just a matter of labor laws. It can also be a matter of what is the practice in terms of what's the collaboration between the unions and the employers. This is not unique just to the ports. I mean, there is, at least from my perspective, a fairly strong tradition in France for all sorts of different industries to have strikes every once in a while. Less so in Germany, less so up here in Denmark. It varies a bit from country to country in Europe. So at times these strikes are not necessarily port specific. At times they can be more politically motivated, like a general disgruntlement in terms of, for example, retirement options that might suddenly spill over and give rise to strikes, not just in ports, but in other industries as well.
And do most of the ports in Europe have on-dock rail? That was kind of one of the things that I've noticed in terms of efficiency. It's much faster to get out of the terminal if you've got on-dock rail. Since a lot of the European shipments have to move to different countries, is that more common to see there, or maybe about the same?
I don't have numbers on it. I wouldn't say there's a major difference here between, for example, Europe and the US in terms of whether it's common or it's not common. I think the major difference, as I was alluded to before, I think barge movement is used a lot more over here in Europe than it necessarily is in the US. And also one difference here in in Europe compared to US, and that's actually also in Asia compared to US, there's a lot more short sea shipping.
So if it's moving on a barge, it then has to go off the main vessel onto the terminal. It stays there, and then it gets loaded onto a barge vessel.
Yeah, exactly. And then it gets loaded onto a barge, which is really no different than also being then transloaded over onto a short sea vessel. The reason for this difference is twofold. If you look at Europe, there are quite a bit of Europe. Let's just think the UK and Ireland to start with. That's obviously not connected. But you have a lot of short sea shipping still taking place. You have a lot of cargo being discharged, for example, up in Hamburg or in Gdansk, for then the feeder movements further up into the Baltics. Out in Asia, you've got a lot of island nations. So again, you've got a lot of transshipment going on. You don't see that over in the US for two key reasons. One reason is the US doesn't have much of a coastline compared to their area. I mean, it's a lot more compact in terms of land size. And then, of course, you got the cabotage of the Jones Act over in the US, which makes it prohibitively expensive to move cargo on coastal vessels. So a lot of that then tends to move inland instead.
The Jones Act seems to be applicable to so many conversations about shipping.
Yeah, but again, maybe to broaden it out, we should also remember that Jones Act is not a unique American problem. There are different countries around the world that have similar cabotage rules. Australia would be one, for example, that also have a cabotage rule that makes it extraordinarily expensive to ship cargo between Australian ports, which means that either it moves inland or you just have to come from abroad. You have elements of cabotage laws in India. They were relaxed a couple of years ago. You have it up in China. You have it down in Brazil. So the Jones Act is not necessarily unique in that sense.
That's good to know. Let's talk a little bit about owning a terminal and what the benefits are. If you're a carrier that owns your own terminal, what difference does it make?
Again, we need to broaden it out slightly because, yeah, there are definitely terminals where it would be a carrier owning a terminal. More common occurrence is that a carrier has part ownership of a terminal. That can be they might own 50%, they might own 25%, they might own 15%. It's more common that they own at least part of a terminal and not the entire terminal. And there are different reasons for doing it. In some cases, the obvious one might simply be that it's a nice and profitable business. We shouldn't discount that one as a reason. But from a carrier perspective, having part ownership of a terminal also conveys a number of other advantages. One key one, and that's the one especially promoted right now, especially by Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd in the Gemini Corporation, is it gives them a much stronger hand on operational control. They can prioritize their vessels when they come in. And in the case of Gemini, that's what they're going to use to increase reliability, for example. That is one access into it. That is one value. Another value, which I also think is why sometimes you see carriers own maybe just a 10-15% stake, is it gives them a seat at the table. It gives them a seat at the table when there are discussions in terms of what new investment should be done. What are the future plans for this terminal? Because the carrier might have a vested interest. This is a terminal that might be core to a lot of their customers. So the carriers would like to have a seat at the table and be one of the deciding factors in what are additional investments to be done. How is this going to be built? That is a lot easier to do if you are part of the ownership rather than if you are, pardon the way to put it, but if you are just a customer.
And I don't know if you know this, but question for you. So when different stakeholders own the terminals, is it usually for a very extended period of time? Because obviously if you're doing big investments in infrastructure, that doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there are many, many different models. Every model you can think of is out there. But overall, when you have a carrier involved in ownership either of a terminal or a concession to operate a terminal, usually you're talking 15 to 30-year deals. It's usually very long-term deals we're talking about here, because the investments you're doing are also something that will run for a very long time to pay themselves back. So these are not tactical deals where you go in and out year by year.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Let's also talk about the impact on customs with the different things that we've been seeing in the U.S. government. So we've seen a lot of cuts to different government agencies, and we may potentially see one with CBP. What would the impact of that be on anyone importing goods into the U.S.?
It's again one of these things that can create also port congestion. Because whenever you are, let's again just take it from the seaside first. I mean, containers are discharged into a port, then they need to clear customs to be taken delivery of inland. And usually that works fairly smoothly. There's some paperwork that goes back and forth with the Customs and Border Protection. The container gets released and it moves out. That's all well and fine. On a few occasions, customs agents might want to open the container and check the contents. That's fine. Where the concern could arise is if, and I stress this is an if, CBP in the US suddenly gets short-staffed later this year. Now, why would I be concerned they might get short-staffed? Well, two reasons. One is a lot of federal agencies have been downsized dramatically in these weeks. That has not happened to CBP. We don't know if it's going to hit CBP or not. When you're looking at the politics of the current administration, I cannot for the life of me see them firing Border Patrol agents in uniforms that are patrolling the U.S. border. I simply do not see that as a realistic scenario. What I would not rule out is, this is going to sound harsh, firing a few thousand pencil pushers that are seen as sitting behind desks. And we have seen DOGE fire hundreds or even thousands of people and only afterwards realized that they were critical. You could mention the nuclear inspectors and the guys that were keeping tabs of Ebola and what have you. And even if that happens in error to customs agents, it's going to take time to get those customs agents back, which means customs are going to be short-staffed for a while. Even if we don't have mass firing of customs, you could have another effect. The old tariff war that is going on is making customs work a lot more complicated than what it used to be. That increases the workload on CBP. So there are a multitude of different reasons why we could easily see a situation later this year where CBP is going to be short-staffed. And if that happens, then containers cannot clear customs fast enough. Then they start to pile up inside the terminals. And when you reach a critical level inside the terminals, then all of a sudden the efficiency of the terminals declines. That's what we also saw relatively early on in the pandemic phase, where a lot of containers were discharged, then because of lockdown, they were not picked up. And a terminal that then gets completely filled with containers, it's almost like playing Tetris with your hands tied behind your back. It becomes extremely inefficient. So that is definitely a risk, specifically in U.S. ports.
Do you think we'd see port congestion to the same level that we did see during the pandemic?
I would sincerely hope not. I would take that as a baseline. The only scenario where I could see that would happen is if we get a basically perfect storm of short staff on customs and at the same time a rapid implementation of some of these new rules with $1 million fees on ships that come into ports. Whereas we've been talking about before, that could lead the carriers to change some of their services to avoid smaller ports, have more big ships come into the big ports. That could trigger such a scenario. Wouldn't necessarily see it as a baseline, but it's also a scenario that right now cannot be ruled out.
All right. Well, I think we've kind of gotten to most, if not all, of the factors that play into port congestion. Let's see if we have any questions in the chat here. We do have a question from George. So I've seen some terminal providers start to get into logistics services. Is this a trend? And if so, do you see it continuing?
Not necessarily sure I would call it a trend, but we have seen some of them. I don't know which ones specifically are being referred to here. Off the top of my head, I can think of, for example, DP World having done it in some different places. And I think part of the motivation, at least behind some of the terminals in providing logistics services, is if you are in a place where there are multiple competing terminal operators. Now, keep in mind, there might be one port, but there might be multiple different terminals. So the terminal operators are competing for business as well. And if I was a terminal operator, I could either choose to see the carriers as my customers because, well, they're the ones that pay my bills. There's not a lot of carriers out there. That's a limited pool to fight for. On the other hand, if I can set up logistics services that makes my terminal slightly more attractive than the other terminals, then potentially some of the cargo owners, you could drive them to say, well, instead of the cargo owner just saying, I want to book with, say, Maersk, then they might say, well, actually, I would have liked to book with Maersk, but CMA is using that terminal over there, and that terminal has a much better logistics setup that fits my inland setup. So for some of the terminal operators, if they're operating in a location where there's heavy competition with other container terminals, logistics services can be one way for them to try to tie some of the cargo owners in and have a preference for a specific terminal.
It's interesting. Great question. We have another one here from Kimberly. So will AI have an impact on terminal productivity?
Let me be cheeky and say no. And the reason I would say it will not, because as far as I am aware, some of the large terminal operating systems that are already in use out there, both the commercial ones and some of the ones that are being bespoke, they are already using AI. And some of them have been using various versions of AI for quite a while. I think it's more a matter of it has not been hyped as much. Let me put it that way. So that's why I said no, AI is not necessarily going to have an impact. It already has an impact because to quite a degree, it is already being used. And I think that might be one of the good examples of the moment we stop talking about a new technology, it might actually be because it's just become part of the daily operation.
Do you know specifically how AI is being used in terminals right now?
No, I think some of the system that it's being used in is down to, okay, how do you optimize the movement around the port? How do you stack all these containers? I mean, keep in mind, if I got a big ship coming in, there might be 4,000 boxes to be discharged, 4,000 to be loaded. And it is a big planning job to try, well, all these trucks that are coming in, where should I put the containers so I am the most efficient at loading the ship and discharging the ship? This is a major puzzle. And that's where AI, to some degree, has already been used in some of these tools for a number of years to try to optimize that.
That's pretty cool. All right. Well, I think we have covered port congestion. We've answered all the questions. Lars, I did want to ask you if there's any current events that you wanted to talk about at the end here, any updates that are worth mentioning.
I think a couple of ones just to round off on. One thing is the one we talked about last time as well, the sale of Hutchison's terminals in 23 countries. The twist on that one is what has appeared over, especially in Hong Kong over the last couple of days, because it appears that the Chinese authorities are not very happy with that deal. And there are basically some very negative stories now circulating with Chinese authorities almost getting to the point of calling this a traitorous deal. So I don't necessarily think all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed yet in terms of internal Chinese politics in that deal, which is actually an interesting twist to the old Hutchison sale that we touched on. And the other one, which I'm sure everybody has noticed already, that there is a new flare-up with the Houthis. The U.S. started a new military campaign, I think, 36 hours or so ago, seems to still be ongoing. Whether that is going to change the dynamic in the Red Sea, it's far too early to say. From a factual basis, there were a lot of bombing raids done both by the U.S., the U.K., and Israel over a 6-month period last year. And that really didn't do anything to change the threat picture. So here, 36 hours into a new campaign, it's far too early to say whether this campaign is any different, whether that will change or not change. The only thing we can say for sure is that the threat right now of going through the Red Sea is as high as when it was also at its peak level last year. That means that anyone that potentially is on the target list of the Houthis definitely should not go back to using the Red Sea at all. Whereas the ones that have been using it steadily for the last year, they're still going through, but these are smaller vessels, again, operated by companies and countries that are not on the Houthis target list.
All right, well, we will continue to monitor and talk about it as those situations develop. But I think for now, we're going to wrap up the episode. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'm Caroline Weaver. That was Lars Jensen. Listen to us, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Music, Spotify. We're also on YouTube if you want to watch the actual video. And if you want to be part of the live audience, you can register for our live podcasts at nyshecs.com/podcast. Everyone, have a great week. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and we'll talk to you next week.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.